Up next, we have got Marc Wilson. Marc has a background in teaching with a research specialization in social psychology. He has more recently branched into adolescent mental health, particularly around suicide and self-injury. He tells us he is here today to indulge his interest in the intersection of political behavior and beliefs relating to science and pseudoscience. Marc is going to help us understand why, despite overwhelming scientific consensus, many lay people don't believe the science. He will look at the role played by broader belief systems and worldviews and present research he and his students have done with thousands of New Zealanders. So welcome along, Marc. Hi there, Marc.
Kia ora tātou.
All right, I'm going to turn off my video and let you take over.
Fantastic. Let's see if we can get it to work. Well, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to finally join. I've been invited to come to this affair numerous times, but I've never been able to make it work, and finally COVID has made it possible. So I'm going to indulge my interest for research at the intersection of political and scientific and pseudoscientific beliefs. And this is something that I started doing out of interest because it was a great way to teach students how to design robust, rigorous research. Let me start by presenting you with an indication of the extent to which we see variation in people's endorsement of common scientific issues. So here we have a piece of work published by Miller et al. About 15 years ago. It presents surveys of people across 33 different nations about the extent to which they believe human beings came to be the way that we are over a long period of time by a process of evolution. So firstly, you can see there's a lot of variation. We have the Scandinavian countries up the top, which are tipping at around about 75, 80, 85%. And down the bottom, we have Turkey. And in second last place, the United States. In fact, if you look at belief in evolution in the US over the last 60, 70 years, it's remained remarkably stable. And only in the last 5 to 10 years has it started ticking up over the 45 to 50% range. You'll also have scanned through this list of countries and will have noticed, of course, the notable omission of Aotearoa New Zealand. So let me tell you what New Zealanders would say if we asked them this particular question. Well, I asked the question in 2008 along with a variety of different paranormal and pseudoscientific beliefs. And in fact, we're right up there with the Scandinavian countries, one of the highest levels of endorsement of evolution of anywhere in the world. In fact, if you also have a look at the top 3 or 4 of these items, actually these are all scientific to some extent. Unfortunately, it's not all good news because we see number 5, number 6, number 7, for example, 44% of people believing that some people can inexplicably predict the future. So there's a fair bit of variation there. Now, I mention this not just to show that variation, but also to highlight something that I think is really important, and that is the gap between lay people's beliefs and those of scientists who know better. So, for example, it's not hard to go onto the internet and find petitions signed by scientists indicating their endorsement of creationism. And as a deliberate counterpoint to this, NCSE hosts Project Steve. Project Steve is a list of scientists whose names are Steve or Stephen, who themselves endorse the idea that we evolved to be the way that we are. There are many more Steves than there are other scientists endorsing creationism. So there's a big gap, at least in the United States, between lay and scientific consensus. Let's take a second issue. In Aotearoa, we have been surveying, as part of the New Zealand Attitudes and Values study, people's beliefs about anthropogenic climate change for 14 years. And actually in endorsement of the opinion, the fact that climate change is real and climate change is caused by humans have steadily been increasing over the last 10 years. And we have further indication in the recent past that this is continuing to be the case. But again, this is different from potentially the scientific consensus. The Consensus Project highlights in the United States something like 45% of Americans think that the consensus amongst climate scientists is towards anthropogenic climate change. The climate is changing and it's humans' actions that are causing it. When in fact it's very easy to find pieces of research that suggest something very, very different. There are numerous studies now that show incontrovertibly that the vast majority of people who have expertise around climate and environment personally endorse and represent in the research that they, based on the research that they conducted, the data that they collected, that anthropogenic climate change is occurring. So once again, we see a particular gap between lay and scientific consensus. In New Zealand, the gap is a little bit smaller. It's something about 60 to 65% of New Zealanders endorse anthropogenic climate change, but it's still a significant gap. Let me take a quick segue and introduce you to a person that many of you will know, particularly people in Australia. Stefan Lewandowski has made a name for himself as a debunker of mis and disinformation, and has authored, amongst other things, the Debunker's Handbook. About 10 years ago, he caused a firestorm by publishing a paper, a series of papers, in fact, that linked conspiracist ideation and beliefs to rejection of scientific positions. So a fairly I'll give you one illustration here. Gone too far. The thing that generated most interest in the media was the finding that people who have greater belief in a series of conspiracies are less likely to believe that vaccinations are safe and less likely to believe in anthropogenic climate change. Multiple people have subsequently gone on to replicate this. I'll come back to it shortly. So if we fast forward a little bit to about 5 years ago, I attended the SCANS conference in Wellington, and as part of that, I was approached by a young man called John Kerr. Now, John was working at the time at the Science Media Centre. Many of you will know the Science Media Centre. It's an organisation that exists to broker relationships between scientists and journalists and to promote good coverage of scientific issues in the broader media. John came and asked me if I was interested in supervising a PhD on some of the things that he and I were both interested in, try and understand a little bit more about New Zealanders' understanding and endorsement of scientific issues. He took as the starting point this question about scientific consensus. Why is it important? Is it important at all? We've got lots of research that shows, for example, that the more you believe scientists adopt the position that anthropogenic climate change is happening, the more likely you are personally to believe that that is the case. And this manifests in a number of different theoretical arguments. Stefan Lewandowski and this gentleman, Sanne van der Linden at the University of Cambridge, for example, are proponents of what they call the gateway belief model. The gateway belief model is the simple idea that by communicating to people that there is a scientific consensus about scientific issues, lay people will be influenced so that their beliefs are more consistent with that scientific consensus. So what does the data show? Well, we've conducted a number of studies on this. I won't show you the results of the experiments. I'm going to show you some of the research that I particularly enjoy doing that makes use of semi-longitudinal data collection. So what we do is we ask the same people the same question several times and then look at the relationship between what people say at one time and what they say at other times. As reasonably good scientists, we know that time doesn't work backwards, so people's endorsement of, say, anthropogenic climate change or their beliefs about the scientific consensus at time 2 of the data that we collect, it can't go back in time to cause people's attitudes previously. So what we're interested in is not the relationship between people's belief in climate change at time 1 and their belief in climate change at time 2, or consensus at time 1 and time 2, we call these stability coefficients. We're interested in the cross lags, the arrows that go between the variables. And the important take-home message here, consistent with what I think is reasonably obvious and what a lot of research has shown for at least the last 70 years, it's not as straightforward as saying, scientists believe this, so you should too. In fact, we know from bodies of research about things like cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias that we could also potentially interpret information about what science says through the lens of our own beliefs. If we believe in anthropogenic climate change, then it makes sense that we would believe that scientists do as well. If we don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, then we have what's called a motivated cognitive stance to reject the idea that scientists believe something different from us. And in fact, that's what we find. We find that people's beliefs about consensus in science are less important prospective predictors of their own attitudes than the reverse. The more you believe in anthropogenic climate change at time 1, the more likely you are to believe that there's a consensus at time 2. Now, predictably, Sanne van der Linden disagrees with us, and a number of years ago, 2018, presented a study that purported to show the reverse, well, a version of the reverse. This was published as a report referred to as the Francis effect, which shows, among other things, something really, really important, which is that you may not believe scientists are the best people that you should pay attention to around issues like science, but there'll be other people in your lives who will be important. So when the Pope sent out his encyclical talking about climate change and people's moral obligation to work to improve our climatic and environmental conditions, this has actually had an impact on the belief, particularly of Catholics, much less so on people of other denominations. But as part of this research, Sander van der Linden and his colleagues collected data similar to what we had done. They collected data about people's belief in climate change, their perceptions of the scientific consensus across time points, and they showed something kind of like what we found, but importantly different. Firstly, we find that belief in climate change does prospectively predict perceived consensus, but that's notably less strong than the prospective effect between scientific consensus predicting subsequent belief in climate change. So they're both important in these data, but the more important one is from consensus to belief. Now, I'll briefly segue to indicate why I'm not convinced by this argument, and part of that is to do with the way that the question was asked. Essentially, participants were asked, assuming that the climate is changing, which of these are the following causes? Now, I think that there's a problematic assumption being made here. What if you don't believe that the climate is changing? If you don't believe that it's changing, how can you reasonably present your idea of the cause? Secondly, the sample was notably different to our own. It was deliberately designed to assess people of faith and to compare them with other people in the United States. So it was heavily religious. Now, Helen Clark many, many years ago noted New Zealand is a very famously secular place, and I'm not sure this is comparable. We've subsequently followed up our own research, collecting data over multiple time points, and continuing to find that, at least in Aotearoa New Zealand, the relationship between one's personal agreement predicting one's beliefs about consensus subsequently is not just the stronger, but the only effect that we find. So why isn't expert consensus a stronger motivator for change in lay consensus? Why is it the case that, at least in Aotearoa, and we've replicated this in our experiments, telling people that scientists believe something doesn't seem to make a big impact on their personal beliefs? I think that part of the clue to this, part of the answer, was hinted at by Lewandowski's work. I've already shown you this previously, that conspiracist belief tends to predict anti-vaccination and anti-climate change attitudes. But I think one of the tragic things about the framing of this in terms of conspiracies is we miss something that is at least as important. And this is the fairly consistent relationship between people's political and economic attitudes predicting their attitudes towards science. So people who endorse free market economics as the way economics should be, for example, tend to be more likely to believe that vaccinations aren't safe. They tend to believe that the climate is not changing. People who hold politically conservative or right-wing views tend not to endorse climate change. They tend to believe that vaccinations are unsafe. So perhaps there's something going on that is less rooted in our beliefs about science, probably less rooted in our beliefs about conspiracy beliefs, and has something to do with our fundamental understandings of the way that social, political, and economic forces work. Let me introduce you to two friends of mine. Well, four friends, really. Principal Skinner represents for me the concept of the right-wing authoritarian. This was characterised in 1981 by Bob Altermeyer, the gentleman with the mug to the right, who should probably be a bit more careful about what pictures he posts on Facebook than he is. Authoritarians believe that you should do as you're told, and if you don't do as you're told, you deserve to be punished. They also tend to have a very traditional, unchanging view of the world, so they prefer things to remain the same. More recently, this very powerful constellation of personality traits has been joined by a concept called social dominance orientation, popularised and developed initially by Professor Jim Sidanius, who unfortunately died earlier on this year. A person who endorses social dominance orientation tends to like to believe that the world is a hierarchical place. It's structured with important people and things at the top, rich white men, and less important things at the bottom, like poor brown women, nature, animals. And that these have important and consistent relationships with people's, amongst other things, political beliefs. We looked at these concepts Right, through a method of meta-analysis. This is Samantha Stanley, one of my ex-PhD students, now a postdoctoral fellow at ANU. And what Samantha did was to pull out all the studies that looked at authoritarianism and social dominance in relation to anything to do with the environment. And what we find is that they're consistent predictors. That is to say, the more social dominant or authoritarian you are, the less likely you are to believe in climate change, the less likely you are, the more worried you are about the threat caused by environmentalists, the less pro-environmental you tend to be at all. These appear to be quite important in predicting. At the same time, correlation is not necessarily causation. Let me introduce you to another of my friends. This is Professor Emeritus John Duckett at the University of Auckland. And John has spent many years developing a theory about how prejudice and intergroup conflict develop. And social dominance orientation and authoritarianism play an important role. John says that we come to like or dislike people who are like us or different from us through a combination of processes that start very early on in our socialization. If we, in our early lives, find our lives characterized by punishment, punitive socialization, we tend to develop a more socially conforming personality that likes to fit neatly between the lines. We see the world as a more dangerous place where people are out to get us, and as a result, we view social relationships through the lens of authoritarianism. People should do as they're told, they deserve to be punished if they don't, and preferably things won't change. And as a result, authoritarians like people who look and think like them and dislike people who look and think differently. A second pathway, which can occur in combination with the first or separately, comes about by an early socialization experience characterized by a lack of affection, not enough hugs. As a result, people develop a tough-minded or ruthless personality that tends to see the world as a competitive jungle. If you don't do it to other people first, they're going to do it to you. You need to protect your goodies and try and grab other people's. And unsurprisingly, people who see the world as a competitive jungle tend to be more in favour of hierarchical social relationships. People who are different from us threaten the stability of those hierarchical relationships, and as a result, we don't like them. We can use this general framework to try and understand some of these types of scientific issues. I could show you any number of things at this point. I could show you vaccination beliefs, I could show you beliefs about evolution, and we get a very, very similar relationship. Essentially, what we find is that, indeed, competitive world beliefs predict social dominance orientation, dangerous world beliefs predict right-wing authoritarianism, but both of these, in the study which was conducted in 2014, then go on to predict belief in anthropogenic climate change. That's to say, the more social dominant you are, the more endorsing of these social hierarchies, the less you believe in climate change. The more you believe that people should do as they're told and should be punished if they don't, the more you oppose the idea of climate change. Quick segue to something that's going on at the moment. You drive through bulls. I haven't driven through bulls for a couple of months, but last time I did, even the bulls there are wearing anti-COVID masks. These constructs also do unsurprisingly, a pretty good job of predicting COVID skepticism. The more authoritarian or social dominant people are, the less likely they are to believe that COVID is real, that it's dangerous, and that we should be doing the sorts of things that we are currently doing. But back to John Kerr's work. In 2019, just before COVID became a thing, we surveyed 9,000 New Zealanders with a whole bunch of different questions about their political and social attitudes, authoritarianism, social dominance, and beliefs about science and scientists. I apologise in advance, this is the world's worst PowerPoint slide. I have many, many things here, but the important things to note are that on the left, we have our focal constructs, authoritarianism and social dominance. At the far right, we have the scientific issues we're interested in understanding: anthropogenic climate change, evolution, safety of GM foods, safety of vaccines, the safety of fluoride in our water. And in the middle, we have a variety of different things that research has shown to be important as predictors of scientific attitudes. We think of these as mediators, the mechanisms by which things like authoritarianism and social dominance might act on people's beliefs about scientific issues. They include things like conservatism, free market beliefs, conspiracy thinking. But you'll note at the bottom something quite important: the extent to which people think that science and scientists are credible. So the first take-home message is that both authoritarianism and social dominance predict most of these things, not consistently, but most of them. But what they both predict is people's beliefs about the credibility of science. The more authoritarian you are, the more dominant you are, the less you see scientists as credible. If we look at the next set of relationships between our mediators and our outcome variables, they're reasonably consistently predictive of things. In Aotearoa, conservatism only predicts people's positions on climate change. It doesn't predict them on other things. But the only thing that predicts all of the positions on these scientific issues is people's beliefs about the credibility of science. So what this really shows is that social dominance orientation and authoritarianism, these two fundamental social and political attitude constellations, appear to predict opposition to conventional science, in part because people are driven to feel that science and scientists are not credible. We've also replicated this in reasonably large American samples as well, so it doesn't just happen here. Finally, let's add in trust in science into what's happening around COVID at the moment. So I've already shown you part of this analysis, that authoritarianism and social dominance predict COVID skepticism, but trust in science plays an important role. It is the case that the more authoritarian and social dominant you are, the less you trust science, which in turn is a strong driver of your COVID skepticism. I'll finish with this last slide, presented without comment. I will quickly interpret it. It's based on some research conducted by colleagues in New Zealand and Australia, and it involves measurement of people's conspiracy beliefs, their political beliefs, and the extent to which they trust in science. The important take home here is that distrust in science is particularly problematic for conspiracy belief in the context of political conservatism. This figure shows that for people who tend to trust science, it doesn't matter where they are on the political spectrum, that's the blue line at the bottom, they tend to be unlikely to endorse conspiracies. But if you are both highly conservative and you are high in distrust of science, the green line, then you are more likely than anyone else to believe in conspiracies. As I say, presented without comment. Thank you very much to all of my collaborators and literally the tens of thousands of people who have participated in my research. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Mark. That was a fascinating talk. I think that sort of summarised what we as skeptics sort of all know to be true with our interactions with people in the real world about what people tend to believe. We've got a question here from the YouTube chat. So Madeline R asks, if we have ideas for how people come to hold those beliefs, can we develop a way to deprogram them? And who is working on this?
So I don't know exactly what beliefs Madeline's talking about, so I'll sort of have a broad sweep. So we're talking about things like social dominance and authoritarianism, which in a lot of my research and other people seems to be pretty down near the foundation of a lot of the things that we believe. There's a real problem here. Because they have their basis in those early socialization experiences, it's really difficult to change them. That's particularly the case for social dominance. We do know that authoritarians we can change authoritarianism a little bit, but unfortunately we're much better at making people more authoritarian than we are making people less authoritarian. So by making authoritarians worry about things, if we threaten them, they become more authoritarian and tend to be even more problematic. So in fact, I think what I would do is do something a little bit like what Sander van der Linden and Lewandowski suggest, which is let's not make it about an argument. Let's try and find an indirect way. So there's some great research in Australia, which has involved asking people, imagine the Australia in 50 years' time that you want. What would that be like? And then what these researchers show is that when you then feed that back and say, okay, so you want Australia to be like this, does it really hurt if you actually try to reduce your consumption behaviours? Does it really hurt if you try to buy recyclable products? Does it really hurt if you try to conserve? And what they essentially find is that climate change mitigation actions are much more palatable when they're presented in that form than when we shout at people and tell them they're stupid and wrong. Because I don't know about your experience, Craig, but generally speaking, when I've tried to do that, people don't change their minds.
Yes, I have tried many times and it's not been successful. I guess what you're driving at is what we really all want to have happen is to get people to think about what they actually believe and start asking themselves some questions about why they believe these things and try and logically follow through the consequences of those sorts of things they believe.
I'll riff off that very quickly. In different contexts, that we know that authoritarians and social dominants respond differently to those kinds of things. So in the context of racism, Bob Altermeyer has asked people, gets people to fill in measures of racism and then says to them, do you want to know how racist you are afterwards? Authoritarians say, no, I don't want to.
They already know.
They're very self-righteous. And social dominants say, yeah, sure, because they already know that they're bastards.
Right. Okay. So we've got one more question here. This comes from Linda Tolberg. How do we explain the wellness crowd who accept climate change and may be politically liberal but reject GMOs, vaccines, and fluoride?
Yeah, this is really interesting. A number of books. I can't remember the journalist's name. A book was published about looking into the whole 1080 thing, and it identified a really interesting group, a real interesting coalition of people who were opposed to 1080, which included people sort of hardcore hunting fraternity who tend to be both male and quite conservative, as well as people who are very liberal, very Green Party voters, essentially. I think what that highlights is that it's more complicated, right? And we see some of this playing out at the moment in terms of some of the protests around mandates and COVID. We've got really interesting coalitions of people. So we have the Destiny Church crowd, but we also have people from reasonably far right political and social leanings who are coming together united by this particular issue. And I think that part of the challenge here, I think there's a real challenge here for understanding how those coalitions develop. I don't have the answer to it, but I think that some of the sort of the work that's going on in Auckland under Sean Hendy's group, for example, looking at how these things evolve in real time through social media are going to be really, really important. That was a non-answer.
Okay. One last question, maybe, hopefully you can fit it in the time. Is it distrust in science and belief in conspiracy likely to become more prevalent over time? It seems that the internet has been a major enabler for the spread of recent conspiracy ideas.
Yeah, so I've been tracking New Zealanders' beliefs in conspiracies for at least 15 years now. There does seem to be a weak increase in that. There has been an increase globally ever since 9/11, which also happens in the context of the internet, which allows a relatively small group of people to actually come together in a way that they were not previously able to be. You've probably seen the analyses that show that in March this year, 80% of the COVID-related disinformation was generated by a very small group of people and disseminated through social media. And of course, the social media algorithms mean that once you head down that rabbit hole, you're much more likely to stay there.
All right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Fascinating ideas and fascinating talk. Thank you very much, Marc Wilson.
It's been a pleasure.